So the latest batch of upcoming Marvel Snap cards has been datamined, which means we're getting an early look here at some of the January 2024 season of cards. So obviously I want to walk through each of these, talk about their effects, how they might be utilized, and rank them from best to worst, so I can lock in those predictions and you can all make fun of me down the road when they're horribly, terribly incorrect. But I do think we have at least a couple cards here with some really big potential. So let's jump into it, kicking it off here with Skaar, a new 6/11. He costs 2 less for each of your cards that has 10 or more power. So if you've got some big stuff in play already, you can get your Skaar here discounted pretty significantly. And it doesn't really take much to make this card insane, right? You don't have to go to 0 necessarily to make Skaar feel really good. Like a single 10 drop makes this a 4/11, which is not a bad play, even on a final turn scenario. You know, like weave in a 2-drop, play your Shadow King or whatever to answer the opponent, play a Skaar for some power elsewhere. That's not a bad line at all. If you have 2 10 or more power cards, this becomes a 2/11, which is just absolutely nuts, obviously. That could be a fantastic final turn addition. And if you do somehow manage to get 3 10 or more power cards early, of course, a 0/11, like forget it. That is just absolutely nuts. So I do think there are some ways to get, 3 10 or more power cards in play early on, which is stuff like Lockjaw, where you can cheat some things into play early. Sometimes that Lockjaw location can actually get like 3 big cards early enough. If you play like a Wasp on turn 3 to get a big one, something on turn 4 and something on turn 5, there's 3 10 or more power cards potentially, although not guaranteed. Chavez and stuff might be in the mix at 9, but that could be a great way to cement one lane and then go hard on Skaar somewhere else. And I know what you're thinking, my god, so much Shang-Chi bait, Regis. Everything's getting Shang-Chi'd. Well, what if I told you it wasn't? Because we're going to talk about this card in a minute that prevents your 6-cost cards from being destroyed. Suddenly you're like, wait a minute, that's a pretty nice little sneaky combo. Maybe we could protect all these from Shang-Chi. So Lockjaw would be one way to like push this all the way down to 0, but you don't necessarily have to, right? There are other on-curve lines that are bigger than 10 power. You've got things in the 4-cost slot like Typhoid Mary, which gets played a lot. You've got Sentry as a possibility. You could even go like Atuma or Namor as additional ways at 4, and then 5 drops. You've got a little more flexibility there, but Red Skull, Dr. Octopus, those come to mind pretty early on. So you can hit a pretty natural turn 4, turn 5 with multiple 10s, and then just play Skaar for 2 on turn 6. That's like 3 locations that are already got a ton of meat. And then, if you played some good stuff from 1 through 3, you play something alongside Skaar on 6. That's a deck, honestly. Maybe you got some Sentry stuff to figure out, but there are still plenty of opportunities there to build a deck, probably just out of the big cards, basically. And you may not need any crazy additional support to make all of that work. So although I don't know if there's a really obvious home for this outside of maybe some Lockjaw stuff, I do think this has a lot of potential. I think it lives in a similar space to something like She-Hulk. Of course, does make a lot of sense that they'd be mechanically a bit connected there as Hulks. But ultimately, probably just good enough to find a home, right? Decks will find an excuse to play a 2/11. The 2/11s are really strong. And the fact that you can dump it late as well means it can be a surprise 2/11 that gets around those Shang-Chi problems of the world and so on. So I like this card. I think the efficiency here is nice, and it just, don't get lost in the fact that it doesn't take much. A single card making this a 4/11, that's not necessarily bad, and I don't think it's tough to get to 2/11, which is really good. You don't have to go all the way to 0 to make this nuts. So let's move on over to Caiera, which we just teased. She is a new 3/4 ongoing. Your 1 and 6 cost cards can't be destroyed. Which is a really cool sort of effect here. It's living in that armor space where you've got an ongoing card being utilized to protect your stuff. Notably, this is only affecting your cards, not your opponents, so it doesn't have that like disruption of something like armor, but it has other advantages. Perhaps most important is that it doesn't have to be in the same location as those other cards. It's working across the entire game. It doesn't say here. So you can have a 1-drop or a set of 1-drops on the left, the big 6-drop landing on the right. They're all protected. Killmonger does nothing to your 1s. Shang-Chi does nothing to your 6. And all you had to do is weave in this 3/4, which really isn't too punishing of a play if you're running all of that. And I think one deck in particular actually jumps out really nicely for that, which is Spectrum Ongoing. This is an ongoing card. Those Spectrum decks love having a bunch of cheap ongoing cards like one cost stuff that's later going to get buffed up by the Spectrum. They're no longer threatened by Killmonger, and your Spectrum can't be hit by Alioth on turn 6. If you have a Caiera, Spectrum won't get destroyed. It'll still work. Speaking of Alioth, this card actually is a great counter to Alioth in general if you're trying to play like a big final turn 6-drop that you need to make sure it connects, some big combo piece enabler. You know, you got to finish with an Odin. You just got to play that giant Hulk in your high Evo deck, and you need to make sure it sticks. And you're worried about Alioth being an answer to that? Well, Caiera comes in, and suddenly that is not a problem. Alioth is going to whiff as long as it is a big 6-cost card. So this is one of those cards, you know, obviously not every deck is going to need something like this. If you're playing like a Zabu Darkhawk deck, this isn't going to help you because all the stuff you care about is going to be 4-cost, right? But if your deck has an alignment where you need to hit those big 6s late and protect yourself, or perhaps you're just running a lot of 1s and you want to spread them across the board, something like a Khazar Zoo deck, which does rely on armor traditionally, but it can only protect one spot. This can protect the entire board of 1s, which could be a really nice insurance basically in your Khazar Zoo deck. So if you have the shape of deck that matches up with this card, I don't think it's too much to ask to play a 3-4. Like, it's a little bit of a down tempo turn. Sure, you might rather be doing other things, but that safety net is really nice, and it doesn't come at a huge cost for most of those decks. So I think this actually makes a lot of sense in a few very specific places, which is often good enough for a card. So moving on here, we've got Hercules, who I think could be a pretty crazy card, but still have some questions about it, I guess. He is a 4/6 solid base stat line there. And he reads, the first time another card moves here each turn, move it to another location. So if you're playing this in a move deck, with some move cards that benefit from multiple moves, primarily those with stat scaling. Think about like Dagger and Human Torch and Vulture. Then Hercules basically allows you to duplicate any of your move effects by pushing them back out. So you play Hercules, and then like to follow up, you play Vulture into Ghost Spider, and Ghost Spider pulls your Vulture over to your Hercules. And then Hercules says, no, I'm going to push you back out. Well, Vulture gets to benefit from his effect twice, gaining +10 off of that one movement action because Hercules has doubled it. So that effectively already made your Hercules kind of a 4/11. Ghost Spider kind of counts for the first 5, and then you get a bonus 5 because of the Hercules effect. And then if you can manage to do that again, say you play now a Doctor Strange or a Heimdall to follow it up, and your Hercules is in the right spot for your Heimdall, of course, then it's going to happen again. Your Vulture's going to move in, and then it's going to move itself right back out. Hercules gains effectively another bonus +5, kind of making him a 4/16 effectively at that stage. Again, I'm not saying he's a 4/16. That's how many stats he's worth. The word effectively gives some of you a lot of pause, it seems. So, you know, basically, if you have the right sorts of cards, the Human Torches, the Daggers, the Vultures, there's probably some other good examples too. And maybe you're getting some bonus benefits from Kraven as well with all this stuff moving around. You can start to see how the extra movement cycles here basically stack up for a lot of power. Now, my big hesitation for this card is really that he's a 4-cost. I think he has a great effect, a great ceiling for the amount of power he can output, but 4-cost is just kind of clunky. That is an expensive card to get down, and it really limits you to just a couple turns, basically, of his effect being active, and you still have to get a lot of stuff going and moving in that case. It's not like, you have all the time in the world, and some of these cards, like, if you load up a Vulture first, and then you Hercules, you can't use a Ghost Spider, because Ghost Spider is going to pull the Hercules instead of the Vulture. So there are some kind of line problems there that can make that a little bit difficult to get everything going at the right time. Now, another hesitation I have for Hercules is that based on this wording, it's not just friendly cards that are impacted by Hercules, it's also enemy cards. So if you're playing against another move deck, like if this ever became popular enough, you could actually accidentally buff your opponent's stuff instead. If they move a Vulture to your Hercules location, he says the first time another card moves here, not just a friendly card. So you could actually send their Vulture back somewhere else, which could buff their Vulture accidentally. Now, another really interesting use case for this, which is probably not good, but worth talking about, is that he's kind of a tech card protecting you against the movement of stats. In other words, if your opponent has a vision on the left and you have a Hercules on the right, and your opponent wants to move their vision to the right because they want that additional power there, they need to, you know, add power right so they can open up a space and play something left or whatever, right? And they need to move vision there because that's where they need their 8 power. Well, too bad. Hercules is going to swat him away as soon as he tries to move. The vision's going to move back somewhere else. Of course, space provided. So you could stop like a Jeff or a Vision or something from moving into a spot where you don't want it to be, which is this kind of little interesting tech option. Like, no Vision, you're never moving to the right, man. I'm going to block you every turn because it could go off each turn, of course. Once each turn, so you could just swap that Vision back like multiple times, basically. I guess Vision usually has one turn to move, but let's say Jeff in that case. Jeff, no, you can't go over here. So there is something cool there, but that seems super niche, super specific, and I don't really see how that's going to be any good. So ultimately, I like how this gives movement, like OG movement decks, old school move, not like Silk move stuff, but the classics, Vulture and Human Torch and even Dagger, gives them that extra oomph, which is really cool. But how do you fit it into turns? Can you make Zabu work in a move deck? Maybe that helps get this down a little sooner. Those are the kinds of questions I have for this, is just fit and curve, because 4 energy is a lot and doesn't give you a lot of time. So moving on here, we've got Grandmaster, a 2/0, and man, this is one of the wordiest card decks I've ever seen. On reveal, move one of your other on reveal cards here to the middle location. Its ability happens again. So it's not that confusing. It's just long. So let's give you an example here. You have a white tiger in the left location. You play Grandmaster on top of that white tiger. The white tiger is going to move to the middle, very specifically the middle always in this case. And it's going to trigger its on reveal effect again, which means, of course, you're going to get yourself basically another 8 power tiger summoned into one of those other 2 spots. And all it took was spending 2 energy for Grandmaster. And like, yeah, he's a 2/0, but he's actually kind of a 2/8 in that case, which that example alone like has me sold on this card being really good. And it's not like the only example, right? There's so many good big on reveals, and you don't need insane results to make it feel worth it when it's only a 2 energy play. So, you know, you got like at 5, you also got like a Black Panther, right? But it doesn't have to be 5. You know, think about like an Ironheart even. Just getting an Ironheart is an additional 6 power. Okay, I played a 2/6. It's not bad. Like, okay, man, that's a good backup plan if things don't go my way with a white tiger or whatever. I'm even thinking of cool stuff like Lady Deathstrike. You play Lady Deathstrike to wipe out all their small stuff left. And then for only 2, you get to move the Lady Deathstrike mid and maybe wipe out a whole nother location of small stuff as well, which is kind of crazy. And notably, because this says move an on reveal card specifically, you don't even have to like necessarily play it perfectly. Like, you could have other non on reveal stuff next to your Lady Deathstrike or your white tiger or whatever, and this is still going to pick the right card for you. Of course, if you have multiple on reveals, things could get a little messier. You might pick the wrong one. Classic kind of Arnim Zola effect there. But basically, you know, you're not like totally restricted. The card doesn't have to be completely alone in a given location in order to move it and get that bonus, which is nice. Also, of course, there's just the kind of redirecting your power aspect of this. If it is like a big Black Panther, just moving it mid can really throw your opponent off. Not only are you going to push it up to like 16 or whatever organically, but shifting that power on might make the opponent completely mess up their play. They're playing a ton of stuff left to beat the Black Panther, and suddenly it's mid, it's not left. So unlike an Odin, which of course condenses all of that stuff into a single location, Grandmaster is a one-off Odin effectively that's also moving your power around in some compelling ways that could offer you some nice snapping and surprise advantages. And then I also think there's like, I didn't even talk about like Shang-Chi or Killmonger. Sometimes, you know, kind of baiting your opponent into thinking that you've used your removal card or your tech card of sorts. And they're like, okay, man, they already used their Killmonger, so I can play these 1-drops safely. Well, guess what? Actually, I'm back for round 2 of the Killmonger, and all your 1-drops are dead. And again, only for 2 energy. This just isn't asking much. I just think that this is so efficient that it's hard to miss with this. And it has just like game making and game defining sort of impact sometimes with the movement and the repeats of really strong on reveal effects. And I don't know exactly what kind of deck wants to run this, but some things come to mind already. Like we've got Ravona's like doing some crazy stuff, it seems like, since the patch earlier today, or that's yesterday now when you see this. Like Ravona decks might be good, you know, just classic on reveal stuff with Wongs and Odins, and this probably fits in there somewhere. You could maybe even do like ramp stuff as well, where you get down a Doctor Doom early and then use this to make more Doctor Doom bots. You've got Mr. Negative seems insane with this because it's going to be a 0-2, and there's all kinds of good stuff like the Iron Hearts and things in Mr. Negative deck. So it's not like this is just a good effect in a vacuum. I actually think it fits into a lot of different deck contexts as well. So to me, this is kind of like an Odin for 2. It's clearly not exactly that because Odin can impact multiple cards. Odin has 8 power, but it's in a similar sort of space. And in a lot of ways, it's even kind of sneakier and harder to play around and just hyper efficient. A 2/8 with a White Tiger. That's got me sold already. And it can do even more than that and make some really big plays, I think. This card seems very good to me. So moving on here to our next card, we've got Miek. Kind of like Mike, maybe. He is a new 1/1, and he reads, after each turn, if you discarded any cards, gain +1 power for each and move. So we're seeing like a few cards here in this batch, by the way, that are kind of combining various kind of keywords or mechanics. Like this is on reveal and move together, so you know, like, is Craven just going to get a lot of benefits from all these cards, right? And then this is discard and move being together. I think in these cases the move aren't really going to be used much for move synergies. You know, we're not thinking Craven and Miles Morales necessarily as payoffs for all of these movements, but we are thinking that the unpredictability of these movements can be advantageous in some cases, or perhaps disadvantageous as well. Which might be the case with this one, which is a little bit less predictable, perhaps. But for Mike here, basically, this is a scaling 1-drop for discard decks. Clearly a similar space to something like Morbius. This is not going to get big as quickly as Morbius for the same amount of discards, but it also just costs 1, and you can just play it alongside your Morbius. No problem. Or if you don't hit the Morbius, you got a nice little backup here as another early game scaler. Discard decks already run Nebula a little bit in a similar fashion. This could just very easily replace Nebula in a lot of those decks. And like Black Knight is good for big targeted discards. This would be good for those just wide full hand discards, like the traditional discard decks with MODOK, where that MODOK on turn 5 could essentially buff this, you know, 5 or 6 or something in some cases, depending on how many swarms you perhaps hit earlier. But you're expecting this card to be a 1/6, a 1/7, maybe even higher throughout the course of a game with some good swarm rolls, which is of course great for a 1-drop. And it's going to be hard for your opponent to pin this one down exactly, because it may not always move where they expect, and you may decide not to move it in some cases. Now Dracula could make that a little unpredictable if you're running Draculas in these decks, as you often do, to pull those Apocs, because it might move on that final end of game scenario. Although this does say after each turn, so maybe actually Dracula would dodge this since it's at the end of game. I don't know if that's true. I don't think Dracula will make this move on the final turn, so you would have some degree of influence, not necessarily with the traditional discard build, because you kind of only have Apocalypse and America Chavez often on turn 6 after MODOK, so it might be predictable. But regardless, I think you're going to be pretty happy to have a second Morbius-esque card in your deck that just adds a lot more efficient power once again. So moving on to our final card here, we have Beta Ray Bill. I know this is one a ton of people have wanted to see in Snap. Beta Ray Bill is a 4/5 with on reveal, shuffle Stormbreaker into your deck. And Stormbreaker, much like Mjolnir here, is going to have an impact on Bill. It is a 0/1, not a 0/0 notably. On reveal, double Beta Ray Bill's power. So instead of Thor getting +6, Stormbreaker can push Beta Ray Bill to 410 at a base. But of course, if you've manipulated this stat in some other way, it can get even higher. So in some ways, a little worse than Thor, perhaps, at a base level without additional work. But there's additional upside, additional ceiling for Beta Ray Bill if you are playing other things effectively alongside this. You know, Shuri it or whatever. It's not the best example, but you know, little location buffs, hand buffs. You know, a Nico hitting it for some extra stats, all of that stuff starts to scale this up, much like we see with Dakin. This card does indeed feel like a bit of a hybrid between Thor and Dakin, kind of borrowing bits from each, shuffling into deck instead of adding to hand on reveal, instead of like destroy or discard, but doubling instead of just a fixed amount. And of course, if you play Stormbreaker multiple times, the scaling gets even better, because the first, you know, action of Stormbreaker is worth +5, but if you Odin it or Wong it or whatever, it immediately becomes worth +10 or 15 total. 2 Mjolnirs is only 12. So clearly if you get a third or whatever, forget it. Beta Ray Bill's, you know, actually insane at that stage, much like we see with our Black Panther doubling. He can get kind of crazy. So I guess the question is, like, where does this live? Does this live in an on-reveal deck with some Wong stuff? Maybe. It's sometimes hard at 4 to fit all of that together into given turns. But, you know, Wongs and Odins can definitely make this carry a lane all in its own right. So that's absolutely a possibility. I think more notably is the kind of Thor crew. Thor on 3, Beta Ray Bill on turn 4, and then Jane Foster on turn 5 to draw both your Stormbreaker and your Mjolnir. You could even see that potentially in that kind of Miracle Hit Monkey deck that I literally posted on YouTube less than 24 hours ago. I have the new Werewolf by Night in there, which could probably still fit even with a Beta Ray Bill in the mix as well. Might be a little harder to pull it all together, but there's something there as well. You know, Jane hitting both of these creates a perfect sort of curve. You could even do all of that with like Odin on turn 6 and have the super Norse build that just has, like, anytime it hits that dream curve, that's going to be kind of impossible to beat, I think. So couple different angles for this card. And that, of course, always makes it interesting. And I think it sounds actually really fun to put all of those in a deck together. And I love doubling like this. Always a scary effect, but that means it's probably going to have a use case. Because when it's terrifying, that's probably because it's good in some way or another. And somebody's going to figure out a way to crack the code on Beta Ray Bill to make this a high value threat. So there you go. Those are the data mined cards for January. And now I'm going to attempt to rank these from best to worst. My number 1 card is Grandmaster. My number 2 card is Beta Ray Bill. My number 3 card is Miek. My number 4 card is Skaar. My number 5 card is Hercules. And my number 6 card is Caiera, which might make you think I think she's bad. I actually still think she's okay. She just happens to be the lowest. Although I thought about putting Hercules at the bottom. That ceiling is high. I think Caiera is a sort of a flatter card that doesn't feel as impactful or as significant, but still gets played. I think actually a pretty good card. So there you go, folks. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these cards in the comments below. Any cool synergies or deck ideas I didn't explore in this video? I want to hear those. Give me your plans. Give me your schemes for how you're going to make all of these various cards broken in one way or another. That said, thanks so much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.